Well, I'd like to welcome all of you to our session of Believe It or Not on Judaism. As I mentioned last week, ordinarily I would have started with indigenous traditions, but because of the schedule of our presenters, I'm going to start with Judaism. So we're now on our path of discussing specific traditions, and I'm going to follow more or less the same outline for each tradition. We're going to talk about the origins of the tradition, historical development, what are the primary texts of that tradition, what are the symbols, the rituals, what's the organizational structure, what's the deal with the clergy, what's the focus of their belief systems, what are the main beliefs, what do they believe about the afterlife, and also what are the current issues facing that tradition. So as I say, tonight we are going to be talking about Judaism, which I guess really isn't a bad place to start. Because if we look at the origins and the age of the tradition, of the religious traditions that are still practiced today, other than the indigenous traditions, which we would have no idea where those began, because those are organic beliefs that a set of people in a particular culture arose with them. Hinduism may be older than Judaism. We don't know for sure. The origins of Hinduism are lost in time. But when we talk about Judaism, we say the tradition would be that it's about 4,000 years old. So it is definitely, except maybe for Hinduism, the longest continually practiced tradition, and really has had more consistency in practice and belief than any other tradition over time of the ancient traditions. So we're going to try to define Judaism. Really, what is it? What is it that makes Judaism Judaism? One of the main things that we have to look at is certainly the history. Judaism is historical tradition, and the history is uniquely important in the life of the Jewish people today and throughout history. It's one of the threads that really binds everything together. The second thing that is highly significant to Judaism is a book. And that book, of course, is the Torah. There are copies on the table. If you want to take a peek at this, we will do so. I'm going to be talking more about this in just a moment, but this, of course, is the main book of Jewish tradition and the Jewish people. So just hang on to that for just a moment, and we will talk about it in a bit. In addition to the Torah, there are other later books of great significance. The Talmud, which is an interpretation of the Torah, a summation of legal traditions and teachings that spring forth from the Torah. And I did bring along a piece of the Torah. This is Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers or the teachings of the fathers, which is probably the most familiar portion of the Talmud, but a very small portion therein. So we can pass this around. You can take a look at that. Well, let me just open it. We'll do a wise teaching, okay? Here's an example of the teachings of the fathers, the sayings of the fathers. Shimon the righteous, and these are all attributed to great rabbis of the past, like 1st, 2nd century. Shimon the righteous was one of the remnants of the great assembly. He used to say, the world stands on 3 things: on the Torah, on the service of God, and upon acts of loving kindness. I have to apologize for my laptop. I couldn't get my printer to work today, so I wasn't able to print out my notes, so I have to go for my laptop. It's been one of those days. All right, there you go. The other third great book teaching within Jewish tradition is the Zohar, which is the main text of the mystical traditions and mystical teachers, although there are many, many writings in the mystical tradition. This is a very poetic book written in something that's hard to read in the original because it's Aramaic, which is related to Hebrew, but it's a very poetic Aramaic and takes a highly practiced scholar to be able to read and translate it. This is a new translation that was done by a scholar by the name of Daniel Matt with extensive commentary. It's a Pritzker edition. It was funded by the wealthy Pritzker family of Chicago. So, and this is one of, I think, 7 volumes. I just brought one of them along tonight. So, we're going to take a step back from the books for just a moment, and we're going to take a look at the historical outline of Judaism, because that's going to set the story for everything we're going to talk about. So I did hand out a historical outline, and I will post this, tell you where you can find it online, those of you who are going to be just following this by video, or I can email it to you. So I said we go back about 4,000 years. And that event that happened 4,000 years ago, although there are certainly things in the Torah, which of course is the same as the New Testament, of those of you who are Christians, you're familiar with all the books. The story of Genesis, of course, starts with the story of all humanity, of not only all humanity, of all that is, because we hear about the creation of everything. But the specific story of the Jewish people doesn't come until after creation and after the Garden of Eden and after Cain and Abel and after Noah and generations thereafter. It comes with a man named Abram, later named Abraham, and his wife, later named Sarah. They were called by God. God said, "Go forth from the land and go to the land to which I am going to send you." He was in Ur, in probably Iraq, and was, of course, called forth to what was in those days known as Canaan, and that's where the story of the Jewish people starts, with this man who just, against all probabilities, packed up his family and followed this command from God. And this is where the Jewish people count their history, along with another major religious tradition, the Muslims also count themselves as coming from Abraham. They are an Abrahamic tradition. But Abraham had 2 sons. His first son was Ishmael, who was not from his wife Sarah, was from Sarah's maidservant Hagar, because Sarah was not able to have children for a long time. And so the Arab peoples, including the Muslims, see themselves as springing from Ishmael. Whereas the Jewish people, this is where we fork off. We see ourselves as coming from Isaac, from the son of Abraham and Sarah. And I'm sure many of you know the story of the binding of Isaac, where Abraham was told to sacrifice his son, his only son, the son he loves. Quite amazing dramatic stories in the Torah. So the history, let's just move through this rather quickly. So we've got Abraham and generations after Abraham until the people, the children of Israel, end up in Egypt because of a famine. And you probably all know the story of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, etc. So the Hebrew people were in a situation of forced labor in Egypt, and it was not a happy experience for them. So a man named Moses, who was a child of the Jewish people, was raised in the Pharaoh's palace and ended up being run out of town because he killed the guy. Had this experience with God where God appeared to him in the burning bush and said, "You're my guy. You're the one who's going to go to Pharaoh and tell the Pharaoh that he's got to let the children of Israel go." And Moses was like, "What? Who am I?" And you know the story. The children of Israel left Egypt, spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. During that time, they were given the great gift of the 10 Commandments, the tablets, which of course is the basis of the Western ethical tradition, is really based on those very simple teachings. So they wandered. They ended up in Israel, where they established a kingdom. The first king was Saul. And now we're at about the year 1000. The next king is David. And of course, we remember the great King David as a warrior and a musician. He's credited with writing the Psalms. He probably didn't write all of them, but he probably wrote some of them. And that was really one of the high points of Israel, was during the reign of King David. His son succeeded him, Solomon, who built the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem. Now, up until that point, the worship practices of the early Jewish people were sacrifices, animal and plant sacrifices, which was common in those days. I mean, they had become agriculturalists. They grew crops, and for those people, the most precious thing in the world was their food supply. So sacrificing of their food is a very powerfully symbolic act. I mean, that's how they saw themselves connecting with this ultimate reality, that which is beyond us. Now, under the kings of Israel, under the first kings of Israel, this sacrificial practice was centered in Jerusalem. And there was a temple built with all the fixtures needed to carry on this ritual in this one place. So worship was brought into this one central location, the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. Now, there was, following that, the age of the prophets. You've heard of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets. Now, prophets in this sense, which of course the prophetic books are part of the tradition, they're not the kind of prophets that see the future, really. I mean, not like, it's more, they give warnings to the people. It's like, you continue this behavior and something bad is going to happen to you. But ultimately, everything will be okay. So it's kind of warning and reassurance depending on what the people needed at that time. Beautiful poetic writing. In 722 BC, at that point, the kingdom of Israel had split into two. They were having some challenges. There was a northern kingdom of 10 tribes, southern kingdom of 2 tribes. The Assyrians came in and conquered the northern kingdom. Now, have you heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Okay, at that point, the 10 northern tribes basically vanished from history. They're gone. And there's many traditions about where they ended up. Some say the Celts are a lost tribe. Some say the Native Americans are a lost tribe of Israel. Some say some went to India, and there's individuals in Africa who definitely see themselves, and they've done genetic testing, that they actually do have Middle Eastern, markers in their blood, that they did some of their family did originate there. So the northern kingdom falls. And then in 586, the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonians. Okay, so we're gone. A few hundred years, they're gone. Many of the Israelites were taken into captivity, sent to Babylon. Some people were left behind. Not everyone went into captivity, but that was a tough time. I mean, these people were uprooted from their homes and taken to this foreign land, although they didn't do too badly. About 50 years later, they were allowed to return. Not all returned. In fact, there are people who still have ties to Iraq. There's really not any Jews left in Iraq these days because of the conditions, but there was a thriving Jewish community in Iraq up until really modern times. And that was we'll talk about the Babylonian Talmud, really one of the great books, great writings of Jewish tradition came out of the people who remained in Babylon. So we go on and kind of jump over a lot of history. There's the Greeks were ruling this area at the time, and at a certain point, 168, there was a revolt by a group of Jews of Maccabees. They overthrew the Greeks, and that's the event we celebrate in Hanukkah, is the overthrow of the Hellenistic, the Greeks. Well, then we end up ruled by the Romans, In 70 CE, the second temple, by the way, the temple was rebuilt in, I think, 535, somewhere in there. The second temple was destroyed in 70, the 70 of this era. And it has not been rebuilt. Now, you've seen pictures of the famous wall, the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. That is the remnant of the second temple. However, these days, if you go to Jerusalem, which some of us have had the good fortune to do, we'll see a great mosque built on top of the site of the original temple. So basically, Jewish people are not allowed, we can't go there these days. Yeah. But the wall, the wall is still there, and that's a place of great devotion and meaning to our people. So with this destruction of the temple and the conquering by Rome, one of the things that really happened were the Jewish people dispersed across northern Africa, the Middle East, and it's the beginning of what's known as the diaspora, where the people spread out. Now, if the worship life was centered in this temple, and we don't have a temple anymore, and we're not in Israel, we can't go to Jerusalem to do our sacrifices and our festivals. This was the beginning of a great revolution in Judaism, and that is the rise of what's known as Rabbinic Judaism. The sacrificial system was gone. There's no more animal sacrifices after that temple was destroyed. Instead, we have a tradition of study and prayer. That is what really supplanted the sacrificial system. Now, I'm not particularly eager to see animal sacrifices coming back. There are some very kind of out there, in my estimation, groups who believe that animal sacrifices will be restored, that temple will be rebuilt. I don't really see that happening, nor do I necessarily think it would be a step in the right direction, but there's room for disagreement, that's for sure. So in this age came the development of the Talmud, of the great codes of Jewish law. Now, and we continue on, the Zohar appeared in 1200. As the Jewish people spread, the persecutions really began, unfortunately. There was the Inquisition, and a lot of it was, I'm sorry to say, by the Christians against the Jewish people. The Inquisition, Jews were expelled from many countries. They were expelled from Spain in 1492, from Portugal, and so kept kind of moving north and east. So a lot of the Jewish people ended up living in Russia, in Ukraine, in Germany, in Poland, Czechoslovakia. There were a number of Jewish people who remained, like in Spain. There were forced conversions. Some people just sort of pretended to convert and maintained their practice. But there's been a lot of tough times, I have to say that. And then we have problems in Russia. There were pogroms when many of the families of Jewish people here came from. I'm sure some of your families came from. Where did your family come from, Saul?
Poland.
Poland. Yep. And when did they come over?
After the war, after World War II.
After World War II. How about your families?
They came here from Spain in the 1600s.
Yeah, the first Jews, 1645, I think was when the first Jews arrived in North America. How about that? Wow.
They helped build the first synagogue in Florida.
Wow. That's a really wonderful piece of history to carry.
And into Mexico and the Caribbean.
Wow. There's some very old synagogues down there, aren't there?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yep.
there are.
Yep.
Yeah. With sand floors.
Yeah, I'd like to see those. How about you, Sharon? Where'd your family?
My family came from Hungary. They came after World War II. Jerry's family came from Russia, and they came during that big Russian immigration.
Big exit from Russia, yeah. And as we know, of course, unfortunately, during the Holocaust, 6 million, about a third of the population of the Jewish population of the world was exterminated. Following on that, the next huge event was, of course, the establishment of the State of Israel. 1948, the United Nations voted to establish a Jewish state in Israel. And that, of course, has been an adventure ever since 1948. Immediately, Arab armies attacked and tried to wipe them off the map, like immediately. And against all odds, the very insignificant Jewish forces were able to overcome them. And that's been the story ever since. Now Israel is a very modern country, leads the world in high-tech startups, but still, it's not an easy place. We, last Saturday here in the synagogue, you weren't here, I don't think, Saul. We had a speaker from AIPAC, which is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. It's a big lobby group. And he talked about all of the threats facing Israel. And it's quite daunting, but you know what? All we can do is look at history and say, my goodness, think of the odds that have been overcome, and this too will be fine. So, that's kind of a brief review of history, all right? Does that kind of give a picture in your heads for those of you who weren't familiar with it? Now we're going to take a look at the book. Now, the Hebrew Bible is made up of 3 parts. No, it's called by an acronym, the Tanakh. So, this stands for Torah, which is the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah is read on a yearly basis. So at the beginning of the Jewish year, after Rosh Hashanah, we begin with Genesis and read through the whole first 5 books over the course of the year. So we get to hear it every year. And it's read in most synagogues, if not all synagogues, in Hebrew. It's chanted in Hebrew. And as you see, let's pass these out. You've got them, okay. As you see in this version, it's in English and Hebrew. Now, not everybody who comes to synagogue is able to read Hebrew. And it's not necessary that you're able to read Hebrew to come to synagogue. Some people do, and some people find it an ongoing adventure to study Hebrew, which I do. I read my first word of Hebrew when I was 40, when I was in grad school. And it was like a miracle to me. It was kind of like reading something I already knew. I can't even explain it. It was a very strange experience to me. But so this is read through in the course of the year. And there's a portion read each week, and connected with each portion, like if you look on page 21, turn to page 21. So this is, we start with the first chapter, Genesis, of course, and each week there's also a portion from the prophets. It starts in the back, as you just figured out if you didn't know. There's a portion of the prophets that's also read each week that is thematically connected with the reading from the Torah. And it's funny, you can read this year after year after year, and every time you read it, there's something new. Because we come to it as new people. A year from now, none of us is going to be the same person that we are today in some way. The world is going to be a different place a year from now, and so there's always new ways that God speaks to us through these words that have been meaningful for a very, very, very long time and still continue to speak to us today. So we have the Torah, we have the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which are the writings. And the writings are Psalms, Proverbs, other miscellaneous books such as Ruth, Job, Lamentations. So those of you who are familiar with the New Testament, it's all in here. It's organized a little bit differently. Okay, the first 5 books are in the same order, but if you look through them, you'll notice the rest of them are slightly differently ordered, but they're all the same. Now, of course, there are many different translations from the Hebrew. There are many, many, many different translations from the Hebrew. And you'll find there's good and bad things about all of them, right? So you just find one that kind of speaks to you. The newer ones are generally better. Some people those in Christian traditions like to use the King James translation of the Bible. That was translated in 1611. Now, not only is the language super archaic, but since 1611, there have been better old scrolls closer to the original discovered, and new translations, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's been a lot of new discoveries. So newer translations tend to be more accurate. So the Bible is read and understood differently by different groups within Judaism. The Orthodox Jews will read this as literally true, that these words were written by Moses, the Torah, written by Moses, like through God, from God through Moses, literally. Moses wrote every word. And that's a matter of faith, honestly. Now, we talked last week about the Bible being subjected to the critical readings, and it's pretty clear that there are at least 4 different strains of writings that have been edited and put together within the Torah, within those books, from different time periods, from different orientations, and they've been edited and redacted and put into the form that we have today. So however you want to read it, that's fine. But we have to be aware that, and when you try to apply a literal historical reading to it, you dig yourself into a hole pretty quickly. Because if you start talking about the world being, created in 7 literal days, well, you start thinking about science and, it's hard to explain. So you run into some logical absurdities pretty quickly. But basically, what it is a story of a people and their relationship with God over time. It's exactly what it is. And beginning with the history of all people, narrowing to this specific group of people, following their journey over time, but always in the context of a relationship with God. It's really a book about God. That's what it's really about. Now, we mentioned after the destruction of the temple, the people were dispersed. We couldn't go sacrifice our bulls and our doves and our grain anymore. So we had the rise of rabbinic Judaism, people scattered, and Judaism was kept alive by rabbis, by teachers, those who took these words, interpreted them, applied them to new situations. Those writings were legal decisions, were accumulated in books. We said the Talmud, of which we had an example in the writings of Pirkei Avot. So a move from the temple to the rabbinical tradition. Focus on prayer, study, and holy living. Those are really the hallmarks of Judaism, historically and today. Prayer, study, and holy living. And of course, we are given the guidelines for holy living in the Torah. Scholars count and say that there are, how many? 613 mitzvot. Here's a good term. A mitzvah is something that you should or shouldn't do. Give me an example of a mitzvah, somebody.
Keep the Sabbath.
Keep the Sabbath. All right? That's a great example. And then we have to think about what that means. Now, on the Ten Commandments, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. What does that mean? Well, there's volumes written on what that means. Okay? And when we talk about Judaism today, we will see that amongst the Jewish denominations, there's a little disagreement about what that means. All right? So, yeah, remember the Sabbath day. That's right. That's a great example. We're also going to talk about plural, this is mitzvot, connected to eating. That's kashrut, that's the kosher food laws. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So those are a couple examples of the 613. Now, many of those, 300 and some of those, are connected with temple sacrifice. So, Huh?
They're a little tough.
Little tough, so you have to look at and say the world has changed. And so we do have to adapt and, kind of follow what the world is like today. So yeah, we can't keep all 613. There's a beautiful tradition that the 613 is related to the number of seeds in a pomegranate. Somebody counted and there's 613 seeds in a pomegranate. So you'll see the pomegranate as a symbol fairly often. I used to have a pomegranate bracelet, but it broke. Anyway, that's irrelevant, isn't it? So we talked about the Talmud, and the Talmud is composed of legal rulings and stories. So there's two different kinds of material there. There's two Talmuds, two collections of these writings. One is called the Jerusalem Talmud because it was developed in Jerusalem. The other one, as I mentioned earlier, is the Babylonian Talmud because that was put together in Babylon, and that is by far the more authoritative and complete. The Jerusalem Talmud is fairly insignificant. All right. So we talked about prayer and ethical behavior as a way of life. One thing I didn't bring out, but I should have maybe, is a prayer book. Within Judaism, there's a tradition of praying 3 times a day. Morning. It's a mitzvah, that's right, to pray in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. And there is a service here every day at 5:30.
5:45.
5:45? Yeah, that's right.
Except
5:40.
for Sunday,
Except for Sunday when
when
it's,
it's a morning service at 8:30.
right. And some synagogues have services every morning and every evening. So, but this we just here have evenings except for Sundays. And of course, Saturday morning services. So the prayer 3 times a day, and there's also teaching that you should say 100, here's another term for you, brachot. A bracha, just put an A for the singular, is a blessing. So 100 times a day, you should find something to say a blessing for. To bless God for your food, every time you eat. Should you see a rainbow, you should say a blessing. Should something unique happen in your life, you should say a blessing. Just many opportunities. And what the purpose of this, right, is to keep our minds and our hearts where they belong. On God. And on that most important relationship. Okay? And so you can find listings of, all of these brachot. But you can also practice this in a more informal manner. Of just thinking about, thank you, God. Bless you, God. So, one of the wonderful things, one of the miraculous things really, is how Judaism has survived. Because there were many other religious traditions afoot in the early days. None of them are around anymore. They're all gone. Except for Hinduism.
Some of them are still in.
Well, in small ways, but as a major force. But we'll take this on a general principle. Anyway, when you think about what enabled Judaism to survive, language, the book, the traditions.
The chosen.
There, you can talk about it in that way, God said, you'll be my people, I'll be your God, and I put you here for a purpose. And you know what that purpose is? To bring light to the world. It's not an end in itself. It's for a larger purpose. To bring these teachings to the world, right? And so maybe this dispersion was for a purpose. Who knows? Everything is, right? Hard to say. Someday maybe we'll know. All right. Next question. Who's a Jew? Now that, of course, depends on who you ask, right? Like everything else, it depends on who you ask. In the tradition of Orthodox Judaism, and we'll talk about the denominations in a couple of moments. Conservative Judaism, this is a conservative synagogue. the person who is a Jew is born of a Jewish mother. Now, why is that? One answer I've heard is you always know who your mother is. What?
Well, the thing is, and this makes it a little odd, that the tribe you're from is based on your father.
Yeah, that's true, but I don't want to, let's do,
So at one point it was
can we do
the father, and then
discussion
that
later?
changed.
Can we do discussion later, so because I might have to clip.
Mhm.
Anyway, so, I lost track.
Was it-
That's all right.
Wes Johnson conservative through the mother.
Right, okay, for the mother. The Reform Judaism, which is the most liberal form of Judaism, says if your mother or your father are Jewish, you are Jewish. Now, obviously, there's another way to be Jewish. I wouldn't be Jewish, would I?
Right.
You can convert to Judaism. And many people do. I mean, you come here on a Saturday morning, there's going to be quite a number of people who have converted to Judaism. It's a bit of a process, involves at least a year of study, and really the adopting of a new identity. I used to teach conversion in Chicago. I've worked with dozens of people who were converting, did their counseling and did their teaching. And part of it is there's a moment where you can comfortably say that I am a Jew, that I am a member of this great adventure. Some people seem to be born with that, even though they weren't born into Judaism, and other people develop that identity more fully over time. But it's a process of study. In most traditions, you go to a ritual bath, which is called a mikvah. It's kind of like a baptism sort of thing, where you're immersed in water with a blessing 3 times. You adopt a Hebrew name. You choose a Hebrew name. You are examined by a board of, and this is in conservative and Orthodox traditions, a board of 3 rabbis. And they determine whether or not you are appropriate to undertake conversion at this time. Now, if you're undergoing an Orthodox conversion, it's very much more stringent, and they're going to look at your lifestyle very closely, that you are following the mitzvot in your life. But you can become Jewish, and really a fairly significant number of people do. So you're either born Jewish or you become Jewish. All right? Now let's talk, so clearly, just another note on that, Judaism is not a race or an ethnicity, although many people who are Jewish do have common ethnic origins in the Middle East, although families may have not lived in the Middle East for a really, 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 really long time. But for some there is that, in a sense, racial or ethnic identity. And it is also very cultural. I mean, there's a big cultural component to it. So one definition that I came across of what it is to be Jewish: those who identify with the religion and spirituality of Judaism. Unifying feature is a belief in the oneness of God, who works in and through historical events and in some manner has chosen the Jewish people as his agents. Now, there are many people who were born Jewish who are not religious, which was kind of a shock to me, to be honest, that I wasn't aware of that until I was in my conversion process. And to me, it was kind of like mind-boggling. But there are many secular Jews whose primary connection to Judaism is through their connection to Israel, or through cultural traditions, family traditions, but really don't have that spiritual dimension of relationship with God. Many different ways to be Jewish. Now let's just say a few words about Jewish denominations. American, we're going to talk about U.S. Jewish denominations because there are some differences in other places. So we briefly mentioned that the most traditional form of Judaism is Orthodoxy. Orthodox, when we talked about our terms last week, we said that Orthodox within religious traditions are ones that kind of hold to the old ways, who don't believe that that religious traditions evolve over time, that they look back to the past and pick their practice really from that place. Now, there's a lot of diversity within Orthodox Judaism too. You go to Israel, you go to the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, you'll see the men have their different branch of Judaism. They wear different hats and different kinds of pants and coats, very distinctive.
Because their clothes come from the past.
Their clothes come from the past. They wear outfits from the Middle Ages. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Good enough for the rabbis, good enough for them.
Yeah, that's right. So, interestingly, the identifier of Orthodox Judaism didn't really arise until Reform Judaism arose in Germany. In the past, there was no real distinction in that way. Reform Judaism arose in Germany in the 1800s amongst Jews who wanted to be more like Germans. They were kind of wanted to stand with a foot in both worlds. So they said, the mitzvot, that's up to you. You can decide how you want to practice this. It's not necessary. You choose. Some of them actually changed the Shabbat services, which, as probably most of you know, is on Saturday. The day of rest is Saturday. They changed that to Sunday. So they had their Shabbat services on Sunday, and eliminated Hebrew and started calling their rabbis pastor. Now that didn't hang around too long. That wasn't super popular, I don't think, but there was this attempt to kind of culturally assimilate, to still remain Jewish in their identity and retain some facets of that, but also to culturally assimilate with the Germans. And of course, there was a reaction to that, and that was the rise of those who identified themselves as Orthodox. We're going to hold to these ways and not accommodate with the modern secular culture. Well, when the Reform Jews started coming to the U.S., there arose in the U.S. a group they called themselves Conservative Judaism, that kind of stands between, kind of middle of the road. So they say that we do hold to the mitzvot, that we really should follow those, but we do have to change with the times. I'll give you an example. There was a ruling by the Rabbinical Law Committee, I don't remember exactly when it was, that said it's okay to drive your car on Shabbat to synagogue. It's not okay to drive your car on Shabbat to Walmart. It's never okay to drive your car to Walmart. I shouldn't say that. My daughter works for Target, what can I say? Because one of the things that's forbidden on Shabbat, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is spending money and igniting a fire. Starting a car was interpreted as starting a fire. But the way people live today, I couldn't get to synagogue on Shabbat if I had to walk. I'd have to come and stay with somebody who lives within walking distance. So we can drive our car. So there is, with the conservative movement, there is some accommodation. Orthodox do not recognize female rabbis. They don't have ordination for women, whereas the conservative and reform movements do allow ordination of rabbis. So there are some differences. Orthodox is 10%, slightly less than 10%. Reform Judaism, about 45% of those who are affiliated. Conservative, about 35%. And there are other miscellaneous smaller denominations that account for another 10%. So,
In the United States.
huh? In the United States, yeah, exactly. And this is of people who are affiliated, right? We talked a little bit about that last week. We should also say a few words about Kabbalah. What is that? Kabbalah is the mystical traditions and practices within Judaism. And there have been, I've done many classes on Kabbalah. So I'm not going to get too far into it because it's complicated, but it's absolutely fascinating. As we talked about last time, the mystical spiritual traditions are concerned with a more direct connection with that ultimate reality through meditative practices and various other ways of trying to have that mystical experience. They date the rise of mystical Judaism, Kabbalistic tradition, to the time around the Second Temple. So it's old. It's been around for a long time. The Zohar came out of Spain in about the 12th century. Now, the people who put together the Zohar said that it actually was written in the 1st century and was just transmitted to them, but it was probably written in 13th century Spain. But the Kabbalistic viewpoint, you'll find Kabbalistic prayers actually in our prayer book today. And really, there's, for example, a teaching which has kind of come into common usage, used in a little different way, that comes out of Kabbalistic tradition, is Tikkun Olam. And these are Hebrew words I'm using here, but I'm writing them with English characters. Tikkun Olam literally means the healing of all that is. Now, it means something quite different in Kabbalistic teachings, but the way it's come into common usage is that one of the things that we should be about as Jews is healing the world, of bringing righteousness and goodness and light into the world. So that's a fairly common phrase that has come out of Kabbalistic tradition. There's a piece of art you might want to take a look at. It's behind this my whiteboard here, but that's a piece of Kabbalistic art. And that's filled with Kabbalistic symbolism, including on the bottom you'll see kind of a structure of 10 spheres. That's known as the Sfirot, and that's a representation of manifestations of God. We could do many classes just on the symbolism of the Sfirot. So that's not much, but that's a little bit. So Shabbat. We mentioned a little bit about Shabbat. Most people know it as the day when Jews go to synagogue. Now, the Jewish day starts at sunset and ends at sunset. So we're just on tomorrow. We've just started tomorrow, a little bit ago. So the Shabbat starts Friday evening at sunset. Sunset Friday evening, and the home candles are lit with a blessing. And oftentimes there's a festive meal on Friday night. Some synagogues have services on Friday night. We have one here about quarterly. Saturday morning, there's a service every Saturday morning, and if anybody ever wants to visit that is not a member of the shul, the synagogue, it starts about 9:30. Well, you don't have to come at 9:30. I usually cruise in about 10. It's different than church. People just sort of come whenever they're ready to come, and there's more walking around and chit-chatting. It's rather informal, in a strange way, but also at the same time quite respectful. So the word Shabbat comes from the word for rest. Now, when we go back to the creation story, God created in 6 days, and on the 7th day, what did God do?
Rest.
God rested, so we are to rest. Now, that doesn't mean that we should stay in bed all day, although sometimes that sounds awfully appealing, doesn't it? But it's to refrain from that which is normally considered work for us. Now, it's outlined pretty clearly in the Talmud what is considered work. As I mentioned, things like starting fires. Now, Orthodox Jews won't turn the lights on and off in their house. In fact, Elvis Presley was rumored to have been, they called it a Shabbos Goy, someone that was hired by a Jewish family to turn their lights on and off and do things on Shabbat that they wouldn't do themselves. You ever heard that story? He was actually supposed to be part Jewish himself. When I was in Israel, staying in a hotel, Friday afternoon, they delivered a stack of pre-ripped toilet paper. Because one of the things that is not a good thing to do was to rip toilet paper on Shabbat. Now, people live this out in various ways. They really do. In most of Judaism, outside of the Orthodox world. I don't spend money on Shabbat. I mean, I guess I would if it was an emergency. but I don't spend money. I don't work. I do things that are pleasurable and relaxing and fun. You know? Make it a day of peace and rest, a day not to spend money. It's a good thing. You don't run errands. And I think there's something to be said for that for everybody. It's a really smart idea and a healthy one in the world today. Now, really, though, in the Torah, it's not only to remind us of rest, it's to remind us of the creation of the world and the deliverance from slavery. So on one day, we are not enslaved by our work. That's a good thing. So the restrictions on work are relatively strict. The Talmud, there's 39 categories of work that can't be performed: cooking, washing clothes, constructing, repairing, writing, making a fire, cutting, fishing, etc. Now, fishing sounds like a very relaxing activity, but you know, it's prohibited. You shouldn't climb a tree in case you break a twig. Anyway, so over the last century, rabbis, they have to figure out how to apply the ancient laws. So there's accommodations that are made. You know, light switches that turn off automatically. Here, if you come to synagogue, at what time do they turn off? Like 1:15?
Not anymore. They had a timer on the switch that turned off at 1 o'clock. And we'd have to go and turn it back on.
Which is not cool.
It's not cool.
I was a Shabbos boy.
Right.
So I don't know if it broke or what happened, but it's been replaced with a manual
Good.
switch. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'd be sitting here having our lunch and all of a sudden the lights would go off and Saul would pop up and do his thing. All right. I'm going to say a few words about kashrut. Well, I'm going to say one more thing about Shabbat. It ends at nightfall on Saturday, and there's a little ritual called Havdalah that you do at the end. When you see 3 stars appear in the sky, you have a glass of wine, you have a receptacle of sweet spices, and you have a candle. So you drink some wine, you smell the sweet spices. Two explanations. One is to remind you of the sweetness of Shabbat. The other is to revive your spirit, because you're given an extra spirit on Shabbat. And when that leaves you at the end, you have to revive yourself. And wine is a common symbol of blessing, of abundance, of goodness. Yeah, I should have brought some of this stuff with. But if anybody's ever interested, I can certainly show you that. Now, a couple words about kashrut. A lot of people who are familiar with kashrut, this comes out of the Torah, but it has been, like other things, greatly expanded upon by the rabbis. For example, in the Torah, it says you should not boil a kid, not like a human kid, but a baby, an animal, goat kid, although sometimes we might think about it, boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, and that apparently was a pagan practice of taking a newborn animal and cooking it in the milk of the mother, which is hideous. Just a hideous thing to do, cruel thing to do. So the rabbis, bless their hearts, expanded that to say you should never eat meat and milk together at the same meal. You can eat meat, you can eat milk, but you just don't eat them at the same time. You have to have a separation in time. So, you wouldn't, if somebody observes the kosher food laws, they're not going to go to McDonald's and eat a cheeseburger because you don't mix meat and milk. There's another reason why they wouldn't go to McDonald's and eat a cheeseburger unless they're in Jerusalem, because the meat has to be kosher. Now, what that means is it needs to be slaughtered in a particular fashion. It doesn't have anything to do with how it's raised, although we hope they're raised humanely, but they're not necessarily. But there's a person called a shochet who's specially trained to slit the animal's throat quickly in one motion with an extremely sharp knife with a blessing. And so the idea is that the animal should be killed humanely. All the blood is drained from the animal because there's a prohibition against eating blood. The meat is salted to further take the blood out. and then it would be appropriate for eating. It's also inspected to make sure there's no like tumors in the lungs or anything that's inappropriate in the animal, and then it would be considered kosher. So you can buy kosher meat a lot of places. It's more expensive, but that's really a lot of the basis of food law. There are also things you shouldn't eat, like shellfish. You can eat stuff that is in the water as long as it has fins and scales, right? And there's been, well, like you don't eat catfish because they don't really have scales, you know. You don't eat eels because they don't have scales or fins. You don't eat shrimp. You don't eat birds of prey. The only animals that you can eat have to have cloven hooves and chew the cud. So you don't eat a pig because a pig, though it has cloven hoofs, does not chew the cud. Okay, now these things can sound rather absurd. And there isn't any logical explanation for a lot of these laws. To me, it's to be respectful when you eat. When we have our Lakota teacher here, I assume he's going to talk about respectfully killing animals. You do this with respect. You think about your food while you're eating it. You eat it with respect. You eat it mindfully. You know, you don't just take any old thing and put it in your body. Now, I'm a vegetarian, which makes keeping kosher a super snap, because I don't have to ever think about it. There are those who take it to an extreme and have to buy special kinds of cheese and stuff, but people who do have meat and milk, some of them have separate dishes for each. All right, now there's so much more. There's so much more that we could say. But I think we haven't even talked about the holidays. Holidays are important, obviously. Passover is the celebration of the release from bondage in Egypt, and we pretty much know that story. Rosh Hashanah is the new year, the beginning of the Jewish year. Yom Kippur follows after 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, and that's a day of repentance, a day of fasting. There are also many other fasts, minor fasts within Judaism. Sukkot is a harvest festival. Simchat Torah is a celebration of the giving of the Torah. Hanukkah, we mentioned about the Maccabees. Purim is another celebration of the Jews getting out of trouble in the book of Esther, and we get to wear costumes and dance. Huh?
Yeah.
Carnival.
It's a carnival, that's right. And there's actually Tu B'Shvat, which is about right this week.
February 4th.
Huh?
February 4th.
February 4th? So, yeah, that's right, next week. Oh, a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Oh, I know, because I was talking to the rabbi last week about him being in Israel. Tu B'Shvat I love Tu B'Shvat, because my undergrad is in forest management, so I'm a tree girl. It's the new year of the trees. It's when the almond trees are blooming in Israel. Well, I hope this has been informative, a very quick dance. I told everybody this was going to be a romp, right? And this really was a romp. I hope it's been informative. And I thank you for being attentive. And we're going to move on next week to talk about indigenous traditions.